surprised a bit in terms of the number of people entering the room. And so we will kick off because we have very little time and a lot to get through. Welcome everyone. It's a real pleasure for us at the EU DisinfoLab to host our latest event where we're welcoming Sarah Andrew and Christoph Schott from Avaaz to talk about regulating disinformation in the European Union, cautionary tales from the US election. So we have two excellent speakers, Sarah, legal director working on Avaaz's anti-disinformation project based in London, and Christoph, based in Berlin, who's a campaign director who's been leading some of the organization's work around Facebook. So during our session today, we will cover three main points. The first, emerging threats and techniques witnessed during the US 2020 elections. Second of all, Avaaz's latest research showing loopholes in Facebook's enforcement policies and fake news correction measures and policies and downranking of repeat offenders. And thirdly, what these developments mean for the regulatory discussion in Europe in light of the European Commission preparing landmark legislation in the form of the Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan. Will the combination of these two pieces of legislation be an opportunity to end unaccountable self-regulation for harmful but legal content? We'll find out. So stay tuned for this discussion. And just very briefly to introduce our two speakers, Sarah has 30 years of experience as a media human rights lawyer, working primarily on broadcast and online content. Sarah, you've been working since until 2016, I understand, as head of online standards at Ofcom, the UK's regulatory and competition authority for the broadcasting and telecom sector, during which time you led, Sarah, the UK Council for Child Internet Safety Working Group, where I believe you developed social media guidelines for the UK government. And our second speaker, Christoph, campaign director at Avaaz, who has been working since 2019 in leading the organization's efforts to research, report, and counter misinformation online, from uncovering vast networks of deception ahead of the EU elections to showing how Facebook is failing in its own fact-checking policies. He has participated in a number of policy discussions and working groups here in Brussels, as well as, I understand, traveling to Brussels for public stunts with a giant Zuckerberg cockpit. Now, just very quickly before handing over the floor, a few quick housekeeping points. So first, note that as of now, we are recording this session, and the webinar will be made available on our YouTube page at the end. We will be using Slido as much as possible during this webinar to enable a Q&A session in the second half of our session. And so please do type your questions into the prompt once you receive it. We want to try and make this session as interactive as possible in the sort of next 50 minutes that we have left with you guys. And then finally, all participants to the webinar will receive a copy of the presentation that Avaaz are giving. If you don't receive it or you want to see it, just send me an email and we'll make sure you get a version of it. It's no problem at all. So I think, Christoph, I will hand the floor over to you. You have really until 3:35 ideally, and then we will pass to questions, and we will see if we can get through as much as possible and still stay within our hour slot. Christoph, over to you.
Right, thank you so much, Thomas, for the introduction. I'm trying to share my screen now. Let us see if this works. Can someone know if they see my screen? Thomas, Sarah, do you see it?
Yeah, so it's just coming on. And also just to say, we are at 100 people and counting participants. So welcome everyone who's just joined us in the last couple of minutes. So yeah, everything looks good on my end, Christoph. I think you're good to go.
All right, thank you for the intro. It is a pleasure to speak here about, I'll start with the cautionary tales from the US elections and what they might mean for Europe and how to regulate disinformation in the EU. And on my way to the office this morning, or around lunch, I was thinking about what is this? What are we showing here? And I think it's less of a presentation, it's more of a warning that each time we really look a little deeper, no matter if it's US elections, if it's COVID, if it's EU elections, each time we go into the belly of the beast, we found a flood of disinformation, of lies, of false information, fake accounts, networks of deception that are trying to steer people away from the facts, from a common understanding. And that warning I want to show you today, talk it through, take you one level deeper, hopefully, and then come up with some solutions that we think actually there is a way to turn this problem into an opportunity to actually come close together. And to set the state right, I want to start with a very provocative question. So don't take it personal. Just sit with it for a second, because it will take us straight into one of the problems that we've seen in the US elections. The question is the following: would you vote for a pedophile? Said it's provocative, and just sort of like just for a second thinking about it, if that would be the case in your country, even if you would maybe support the party of the candidate, would that be enough to kind of make you at least think about, if you really believe it, think about, is that the right candidate to vote for? Because that was one of the narratives that we've seen spread quite far ahead of these elections. So you had two examples of posts, basically just showing different images of one of the candidates with children or young women, and just calling them pedophile, saying he's the pedophile in chief. There's many more reposted again and again in different kind of shapes and colors, small iterations to it. And to go down a little deeper, just because to see that it's often not just one post about a false information, it is a slew of them over and over in different iterations that then make something stick. So you can see on the left that is, according to the person who posted it, a discomforting photo of Joe Biden with his child. He's another one accusing him of kissing a 15-year-old girl or even making out with her. The first one was 18,000 shares. This one is almost 8,000 shares. There's a third one, allegedly him groping a woman that is not his wife. That alone, like that post alone, had 250,000 shares, which we estimate is likely about 5 million or more views. What's the problem here? All of them are false, of course. The first one is clearly out of context. The photo is real, but that is Joe Biden at the funeral of his own son, who died of brain cancer, with his grandson, where he's comforting him. So it's not a discomforting image, it's actually one showing like being with his grandson. The second one is not a 15-year-old girl, it's its 19-year-old granddaughter, and it's not making out, he just kind of gave her a kiss at that event. And the third one is photoshopped. So as you can see, that's the real image, and they just photoshopped the arms higher up. It's a job well done in terms of photoshopping, but that is how easy you turn a real image into a fake image and get millions and millions of people to see it. All of these posts are still on Facebook. All of them now have an overlay, but that did not prevent them from being seen millions and millions of times, shared hundreds of thousands of times, and in many cases believed to be true. While of course PolitiFact says there's no credible evidence that supports this claim. So no evidence that in the 40 years of Joe Biden's public life, there's no news reports, formal accusations, or anything that involve him in any sort of sex crimes involving kids. And yet, we have SurveyUSA has run a survey, and 48% of American voters, registered voters, said they have seen this claim. That is, we just extrapolated that out. That's equivalent to about 76 million voters. That is about as many people as live in my home country, Germany. And out of those, about 35 million have seen this claim on Facebook, which is astonishing. They've also seen it on other platforms, also outside of the internet, but Facebook, at least for online sources, was very clearly on the top. And what I thought was even more shocking is, yeah, 48% have seen it, but as long as no one kind of believes it, it's not that problematic. But the poll has also found that 90% of American registered voters have seen it and believed it to be true. And that again is kind of equivalent to about 30 million voters. That is more than the population of Belgium, Netherlands, and Luxembourg. So that's a really big amount of US citizens, voters, that was ahead of the elections, who believed this claim to be true, even though it was not based on anything, based on any facts. And so the question that has always been asked after the 2016 elections, being asked again now, I guess, can such disinformation influence an election? I don't know if this one specifically can, but when we drilled a little deeper into some of the numbers, for example, looked into Georgia, which was decided by about 14,000 votes. It's still being recounted as far as I understand. So that might change a little bit, but a small margin. And just in Georgia, according to the poll, about 11% of Democratic voters, I would say that Democrats, believe the story to be true. And that's equivalent to about 310,000 Democratic voters who believe this to be true. That's about 20 times as much as the difference there was in North Carolina, which was decided by more, 75,000 roughly. We have a similar number of like 240,000. And it's a very rough estimate based on those polling numbers. But just to give us a sense of like, wow, if even Democratic voters believe the story to be true, a good hundred thousands of them, and they may be not voting anymore because of it, or if they see 3 of those kind of claims and they're not sure anymore, that I think can actually be at least a part of tipping a state or the support for a candidate one place or another. So that was a bit of a deep dive, but it was of course not only on political misinformation. The same happened on the Mainland ballot fraud, which I think by now everyone has seen in some ways. Before the elections, already 85% of registered voters were exposed to it. 76% have seen it on the internet, 68 of those on Facebook, and 41% of those who've seen it believed it to be true. On the left side, there's one of those many fakes that we have seen. This one was shared 130,000 times about receiving 5 ballots to vote, or 5 applications to receive ballots. And then post-elections, The Guardian has published a poll saying that after the election, 70% of Republicans say that the election wasn't fair. And out of those, 78% said it's because of unfairness in mail-in ballots. So the next administration will have a very, very hard time to make people trust in the government, trust the elections are fair, and trust in democracy, right? Like slowly but slowly, that's how democracy erodes, and people lose trust in anything. And so they just believe in what they, or their kind of peers and the groups they follow might tell them. Another issue, it's also not just around elections. We've seen similar problems around health, maybe even bigger and maybe more damaging. So here's an example of a story that health experts advise that drinking water frequently can drive the new coronavirus to your stomach with the exit kills it. That has been seen at the time of the polling by 25% of US citizens. Half of them have seen it on Facebook. The problem that I see here is like really damning is like over half of those who've seen it on Facebook, YouTube, or Twitter believe it to be true. And those people who were polled, who have not seen the claim until they were polled, only 9% believed it. So you can see that seeing is not directly believing, but seeing a claim that might be believable really increases the chances that you then might believe it and follow the false health advice, which is really dangerous, as we all know now that most of us, I guess, are into the second wave. So of course we ask, how is that possible? And here I want to share just like 3 directions and kind of what we call loopholes or problems that we saw, especially on Facebook, which is what we investigated mainly because it's just the biggest platform where most of the false information seems to be spreading and seems to be then reaching people. Reason number 1, the fact-checking failure. We have done a study on just looking for kind of clones of misinformation. So on the left, you can see one of the examples we looked at before that is labeled by Facebook by now. On the right side, it's basically the same claim. It's a little different color. The text is a bit different. There is no label. I think that still is no label on Facebook right now. It was similar for other issues. So on the left, you can see the false information about you need 2 stamps for mail-in ballots. That has a partly false information label. On the right side, basically the same, has no label. I think to date still has no label, and 20,000 shares. So basically the same thing, Facebook's AI detection system that they say is incredibly smart and was not able to catch that these are basically the same false information and therefore should both have the same label. It should not be removed, but at least people should know when they see it, oh, this is false or at least partly false. Let me see what is behind it. So that was one of the big gaps we identified. Overall, we saw about 40% of the fact-check misinformation that we analyzed was able to kind of get around Facebook's policies, its own policies. And just the data we analyzed had 142 million estimated views on unlabeled misinformation. And that is like, as usual, the kind of the tip of the iceberg of what we're able to find from the outside with the limited resources we have. And Facebook, of course, does not disclose how much of the misinformation they are not labeling. They just disclose how much they label. And the other problem is that it often takes quite a while. 1, for fact check to happen, 2, for Facebook to apply the label, And in that time, often posts go viral. This is an example from a study before that's now kind of moving away from the US for a little bit, just show this is not just the US problem. This was a Spanish video about, I think about the COVID being a bioweapon from China, and that was reaching 33 million views before it was labeled. And afterwards it was slowed down. And the problem here is, of course, that the people, those 33 million views who have seen it, some might believe it, will never be informed by Facebook or anyone that this was false and might still believe this is true. And therefore we're seeing a big gap here of like, yes, fact-checking needs time. Sometimes it needs time to apply it, but then please at least go back and tell people, show them the fact check so they can at least correct their view on things. And there's many, many, many studies that show that corrections do work and can actually cut the belief in disinformation by almost half. And here's another one from that COVID research. There was a small sample size, but we just saw that kind of outside of the English stratosphere, Spanish, Italian, Portuguese, actually the number of fakes that we found that were labeled was even lower. So in languages, it is very likely that Facebook is not even doing an as good job as in English, where we already think they're failing. So for Europe, especially smaller countries where Facebook might not have that much of a business interest, this is even more worrying. Sorry, I'm speaking fast to try to get to all of this evidence. Reason number two that we think so many people are being reached is that the Facebook algorithm is accelerating content, borderline content, misinformation, and also repeat misinformers. So we looked at basically pages and groups for the month ahead of the elections that have repeatedly shared misinformation. And as you can see in this slide, the biggest ones of them have kind of kept on the same level. They had quite a peak end of 2016, where of course we had the last elections, and then they skyrocketed in 2020 towards the last kind of 3 months, where they had like almost 3 times as many interactions as kind of in the years before. And maybe even worse, they basically caught up with the top 100 news media on Facebook, including Fox News, CNN, New York Times, meaning even though those media sites had kind of way more followers, likes, and that means that the algorithm is just driving interactions and therefore views onto these repeat misinformers, which are able to create content, meme content, borderline content, some true, some false, and that then each post kind of reaches a significant amount of people and overall kind of catches up with the high qualitative media, including on both sides, basically in this case. And that is really worrying because there's a limited amount of media sites, quality media sites in any country, but there's a very big amount of pages and groups that are low qualitative. And if the top ones already catch up, that makes me worried for the broader picture. And here's just another example. You might have seen that. Facebook took down a widespread network of pages tied to Steve Bannon that used inauthentic coordination or inauthentic measures. Facebook never really discloses stuff for pushing out their content and make it more seem more popular than it is. Problem is, Facebook only took them down after the elections and only after we sent them kind of the evidence that we have found. And it was quite obvious, and we are kind of shocked that their systems didn't catch this themselves. And they pushed a lot of the stop the steal misinformation messages that now have kind of being spread across the US. And reason number 3, the one that I think is basically the biggest problem behind all of this, and is also the reason why we need to regulate Facebook and others. There's a huge lack of transparency and a massive inconsistency in the policies that Facebook and others put out themselves. You might remember that Hunter Biden email story, and the piece that we want to focus on is that Facebook themselves said they downranked the story before it was fact-checked. And they said that was because they had signals that this content is false. If they have signals that a content is false, they temporarily distribute pending temporary reduced distribution pending review by third-party fact-checkers. The problem is they don't make those signals public. No one knows what those signals are. Like, what is it, the algorithm? Is it users? I don't think they have until now. And that, I think, is really scary. Like, if at least they're clear, public, they work with fact-checkers. If it's fact-checkers being downranked, it's public, it's transparent, that's one thing. It's likely a good thing to do. But just using signals that no one else has to then downrank a story is, I think, a piece where Facebook and others likely kind of taken a step that I think is much better done by clear regulation and clear alignment on what is kind of for the platform to do and for fact checkers and civil society to decide. Same for some repeated misinformers we saw. They were like suddenly demoted. This one is one, James D. Harris, at the beginning of September. Others, the quite famous or popular Dan Bongino, who racked up views until the elections, basically. And the problem is that then, of course, some of them who are being downranked, here's 2 of them, then cry foul, say like, we have been unfairly downranked out of the elections. And because also no one knows why, right? Like we don't know exactly why they've been downranked, at what point, how many strikes, how many misinformation posts they shared. And that is really problematic because then of course people cry out, say censorship, and because there's no transparency at all of like who exactly is being downranked, what exactly is the policy. And yeah, there's also some initial kind of findings from, there was one on the Washington Post, I think the other one was from BuzzFeed actually, about a kind of Facebook executives then would intervene in case some of the big pages that are more political and that might cry out for censorship. And if they would kind of be caught by the misinformation policy, then they might not take such hard measures as they normally would. And that is just as concerning as like, so is it, do you now have a policy that says 2 times misinformation in 3 months and you be downranked, or do you not have it? Or do you just then make a kind of case-by-case decision based on your executive decision-making? And that is worrying, I think, and needs clear transparency and accountability for platforms. And last but not least, we've seen similar issues around ads where no misinformation just slips through the system. In this case, we found super PACs on both sides posting Facebook ads reaching up to 15 million impressions with fact check content by Facebook fact checkers that they should know is false. Then sometimes it's being taken down, removed, then put up again with a slight tweak. And so nobody can really see through it. And we still don't really fully understand how the system works and how do you exactly get a strike and how do you not. And I think Facebook has tried to do a good job with the ad library. They've done overall like improvements from misinformation labeling to downranking some of the biggest groups and pages, but by far not enough and not transparent or consistent at all. And that is why we think so many people have seen and are believing some of these false accusations and informations. And with that, I'll hand over to the more positive part of this because I think, or we think there are things to do about it. And my lovely colleague, Sarah, will take it from here so I can take a breath. Thank you, Sarah.
Thank you very much, Chris. And thank you, Thomas and DisinfoLab for inviting us here to talk to you. God, that was a lot of information, wasn't it? And I think what I'm going to ask you to do is maybe just have a little think about some of the bigger issues that all of that data brings to mind. And I think the first thing I'd like you to think about is belief, because we have indications in some of the research we did that there is something happening here. There is something happening about the nature of belief when you see information in your social media feed that you have integrated into your home life, you've integrated into your family interactions, you've integrated into your life. Now, I've been warned about causality, and I'm going to be really careful about what I say, but there is something happening about the nature of the fact we appear to be able to believe disinformation when it appears in the context of our social media feeds, when if we read it in a newspaper or we read it in being polled about it, our belief decreases. And the second issue I want you to think about, have floating in your mind before we go into the regulatory options, is that question of scale. Because let's face it, this information is massively at scale. Some of the data that Christoph was reading there, we're talking about 72 million views. I think that issue of scale has perhaps in the past kind of dampened the appetite to try and deal with what is happening in our communities and to ourselves in terms of disinformation on social media. And I'll confess, I think Thomas outed me. I am an ex-regulator. I used to work at Ofcom. And when I was at Ofcom, I always used to hear this phrase about we can't boil the ocean, which was regulators speak for there's just too much stuff out there. There's too much content for us to ever be able to regulate. But with respect, that's conceiving the problem as a content problem, a massive content problem that can never be tackled. And it's not really. Avaaz is absolutely on the side of free speech. We do not support any form of prior content moderation. We don't support any removal of content without transparency. certainly nothing that doesn't rely on independent fact checks, as Chris pointed out in that example on accountability. We actually think that the whole range of the harms we've been talking about today can be managed through regulation, which focuses on the reach of that misinformation. We have a phrase that we use, which is reach, not speech, but it's a kind of simple way of saying that the big issue here is the nature of the delivery of the information to us. It's acceleration through the modern format of the platforms. And over the past 2 years, whilst I've been with Avaaz, I have seen through conversations with regulators, through conversations with industry, and through our own really kind of quite exhaustive now bank of research, that we've come up with these 5 principles which we have been pushing through the moderation teams of the major platforms and the policy teams. And we have seen some movement, but I think it's worth taking you through where we've been at for the last 2 years and what we've been trying to take through to the platforms. So the first policy, a recommendation that we had for the platforms was to correct the record. And I think Chris has really started to explain how consistent labeling is still a major issue for the platforms. They're not achieving correction of material that they themselves know through their independent relationships with their fact checkers is incorrect. And the other issue, which I hope came out of Chris's presentation, is that correction needs to happen not just at the moment, but it needs to be retroactively supplied back to the users. This is the user's right to know if somebody's told me something incorrect on this platform and you know it's incorrect, please tell me about it. Please label it and make sure I get to see that label. The second detox the algorithm policy position is a suite of policies all around trying to stop the acceleration of the data. And we're going to go into that a bit more later on, but put very simply, it's about measures which should improve detection rates, transparently, downgrade known disinformation actors, and start to correct, to rebalance the pushing forward of this divisive and incorrect information. Now, we know we've heard statements from Facebook, I think in the past few months, that they have undertaken some work to try and correct the degree to which the algorithm favors divisive and emotional content. But from what we're seeing from our research, it's certainly not an effective tinkering with the algorithm. And we'll get to a question for position 5, which is about better understanding that. But before we do that, I just want to take you through 3 and 4. Now, 3 and 4 are simple. 3 and 4 are, says what they do on the tin. They are basically give the user the understanding of who they're dealing with and what they're seeing. So just like correct the record, please make it transparent. Am I dealing with a fake account? Is this a real person, or is it just someone who sold their account in Cambodia to boost followers somewhere else? Is it a bot that I'm actually dealing with? Is this an advert? And we need transparency to apply across all forms of advertising, including boosted content. And then finally, why has this been given to me? How's it been targeted? We need disclosure of targeting when it happens. And that kind of leads us quite naturally onto this final request. And this is possibly the one we've seen least movement on, I have to say, from the platforms, which is about opening the black box, which is about giving transparency to the kind of decisions and variables that the algorithms are using to make the decisions. And this is one of the major keys that needs to be given to civil society, to users, to kind of try and get themselves out of the situation they're in. If they don't know why information is being served to them, if they don't know why they see a certain kind of feed and not another one, they can never gain control over the imbalance that currently exists between the data that's supplied to them, sorry, I'm a bit of a data freak, I should say, the information that's supplied to them and the reasons for it arriving on their door. So those are the kind of principles that we have been following through for the past 2 years with the platforms. But they're not quite getting there. And so this is why we're really excited to be with you, because we have concluded that industry action on its own, even if we call it self-regulation, even if they team up together in a great gang to encourage each other to do better, as I think Mark Zuckerberg has proposed, at least at one point, we need regulation that's actually going to enforce certain forms of standards. and to talk about that regulation and to really think about how the Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan can start to bring order and a degree of control over this situation. I just want us to take a little step back and think about the industry that we're dealing with. So we're not at the millennium. We're not at the e-commerce directive's birth in 2000, where at that point we conceived of online hosts who had little to no access over the content that was hosted on them. They were a mere conduit. They were slumbering giants, and they only had to awake and do anything about content if they were woken up with a notice saying, you've got a problem with your content, please do something about it. But nor are we in a position where they have full editorial control. We can see they're not broadcasters, they're not editorializing, but they're not neutral either. They're not mere conduits. And we have this central position on the slide, which is we believe that the content acceleration, the activity of content acceleration has a bias. It has a purpose. And that purpose is to basically keep your eyeballs on the social media platform you're on. It's about the variables that underlie that content acceleration in order to keep you watching. So it's no longer fair to say one has no responsibility at all over the content. You have some responsibility in the way you spread it. And this brings us then, if you like, to the way that we're now beginning to envisage the principles that we came up with and how would they fall within the Digital Services Act, within the European Democracy Action Plan. And actually they kind of fall quite naturally into consumer-focused concerns and into the actions and accounting that we think industry needs to make in terms of its impact on us and our rights. So just turning to that transparency issue, first of all, they're not kind of really difficult to understand, and they're very similar to the positions that we were taking with the platforms. But in terms of the regulation that we believe has to happen, first of all, let's get transparency for all. And by all, we don't just mean the regulator, we do mean the users as well. So the users get transparency over what fact check content is understood by the platforms and is fed through to them. So that's correct the record pretty much as it always existed. We must remember that correction has to feed back retroactively. It doesn't just hit when the platform happens to post it. But I think that's a fairly solid position. But what we need to introduce there, obviously, is standards, consistency, and transparency. Secondly, about sources. Again, we need transparent, no longer listening to the signals in the air of why you might actually want to demote someone. We need transparent set standards about why you would demote an actor, why you would, if it's an advert that's being served to you, and if it's a fake account. I think that's, again, quite simple. And then the final one, which we touched on earlier, is about opening the black box. Now, in transparency terms, we understand that not all users will want to have full access to the algorithm, and we're pretty sure the platforms wouldn't want to do that either. So in terms of users, we're looking at something like choice over whether I get served particular kinds of content, choice over how I understand what data of mine is being used to create that feed to me. But we also think there's a real need for transparency to open the black box to researchers, to academics, and of course the regulator, so they can start to understand the impacts that that algorithm is having. So how is it impacting on me in terms of the variables it's been given? Flipping the coin, and you'll see that these transparency and accountability are really closely interlinked. But if we look at the accountability that we want regulation to build in for these industries, then we want them to be accountable, not for the content, but for the acceleration of false content. We've already, I hope, clearly established we are not believers in taking down content. This is not free speech blocker. Actually, if anything, there are greater threats to non-accountable deceleration of false content when you don't know why it's being done. It's been done entirely privately, and the platforms themselves are inconsistent between themselves as to the action we take. You know, we see the disagreements over certain pieces constantly between Twitter undertaking one action and Facebook undertaking another. And we have no standards to understand why they're making those decisions. Secondly, it's about acceleration of the disinfo actors. And this ties in closely with our concepts about detoxing the algorithm, which, if you remember, about the detection, and demotion of actors, and also the demonetization of disinformation. There's a massive incentive to create disinformation if you can get attractive advertising revenue to flow to you because you're picking the most emotive content. So that demonetization is a very simple step that will decelerate the actors. And that is not, you can see again, it doesn't impact on the freedom of speech of the actors to say it. They just won't get paid anymore for the rubbish that they're passing out. And then finally, we've got accountability for the societal impact of the algorithm. And this is about design. This is about, we have rules around safe car design. We have rules about how much sugar we are allowed to put into products. We need to understand, by opening the black box, the impact of the algorithm specifically on our rights. We don't think we should interfere with businesses unless there's an impact on our rights. But we can see from all the data that Chris has been talking through that there are specific impacts, A, on our right to freedom of speech, because we don't know the reasons why certain speech is taken down and certain speech isn't. It's all privatized, we can't understand it. But secondly, there is an actual direct interference, we think, in our freedom of thought, in our freedom of opinion. Because if you don't know the reason that a particular piece of content is served to you and a particular piece of content is withheld, you've no idea what data has been gathered from you in order to make those decisions, and you don't understand the variables upon which those decisions are made. You literally can't think things through. You don't have the full picture. And it's a bit like those unknown unknowns. You don't know what else you might need to actually form your own opinion. So what we're asking here goes deep into citizens' rights in Europe. So with that in mind, what we would want to see are standardized metrics with annual goals monitored by a regulatory authority. We think that the DSA could be the backbone for this, certainly in terms of bolting on specific procedural obligations across both of those sections. But we also don't want to wait 5 years, 4 years, 5 years, because we understand the DSA is going to take a long time. So we can't have the ball dropped by the European Democracy Action Plan. There are encouraging noises about what it's going to do with the Code of Practice, but we are very concerned if what it does at the moment is only address advertising. Because you've got to remember that most of what Chris was presenting were not open adverts. They weren't in Facebook's ad library. And we will be really, really missing the ball if we only deal with adverts. So just a little step back, we need this system to cover legal but harmful disinformation. We don't want any content liability measures over it, so there is no concern over international law. These are business regulations about the business model of the platforms, and that's what we'd like to see. And I think this time I won't forget the final slide, Chris, which is that we have backing. It's not just Avaaz, it's actually the massive, massive majority of European citizens who want to see this kind of regulation. 87% want social media platforms to work with fact checkers, and 75% believe social media platforms should be regulated. We think we've got a suite of solutions here, and we really, really want to keep the conversation going so that the regulation that's going to be formed right now, we cannot wait till 2nd December when they finally drop, gets it right. And one last, I can see Thomas is saying, come on, Sarah, one last little point, which is that we also feel that the AI regulation, which Europe's also looking at, the white paper, there's an important point there. This is kind of all about AI. And we believe that the risks posed by the AI that's driving a lot of this activity are as serious as surveillance. They are as serious as medical diagnosis, and they need to be encompassed within Europe's AI framework as what they call a high-risk activity, which means that they will have some form of monitoring and design oversight in terms of our human rights. And I'm going to let Thomas come back in there and enjoy all your questions. I'm sorry that we slightly ran over your hoped for timetable, but there's a lot of stuff to get to.
It's wonderful.
Chris, did I forget anything?
No, well, I think that covers a huge amount of ground already, both on the research and on the regulatory answers to the problems that we're facing. And so we've got a huge number of questions. We have 11 questions so far, and a lot of questions around methodology, around how did you develop this research? This is really, I think, more a question for you, Christoph. First question, did you work with Facebook? I think I'll take a couple of these questions together. The first one is, how what's the extent to which you were working with Facebook? Did you use CrowdTangle? How did you use CrowdTangle in your research? How was it useful or not? And if you could say a word or two about research methods, as that second anonymous question just asked there, and then we can move to maybe questions more about the regulatory dimension that Sarah mentioned.
Great. Yes, I'm happy to answer those questions. Because they're the right questions, right? It's like the problem is that, yes, Facebook now has CrowdTangle, which gives you some insight into pieces that are being shared on Facebook, but there is no real insight, right? So what we have used specifically is CrowdTangle to just investigate and build a set of pages and groups that might share this similar content. We often just start like fact-checked information. So we go on the fact-checkers websites, basically, collect a big amount, in this case, like basically over 1,000, I think, different fact checks, and then see what kind of pages and groups have shared them. And what we started building kind of ourselves this time was what we call Factory, where we actually were able to get in like automatically get in all the new fact checks from a good amount of the fact checkers that work with Facebook, and therefore then use that, all the data, to then see what pages, what groups have shared these misinformation posts. And from that, we kind of built a big set of like basically thousands of pages and groups that we then monitored to see who's doing what, how are they interconnected. Then we have some other tools that we developed to see like, if this page is sharing a piece of content, what other page is shared within seconds from it? So you can see some sort of coordination. So we used mainly kind of CrowdTangle, there's BuzzOmo, there's a few other tools that we just used in coordination, and then did our own research and like compilation of some of this stuff. But that said, one, you need much more access, right? It's always really like, I hate to use this meme again, but it's just the tip of the iceberg that we're able to see. And two, if you're doing research yourself, a lot of it is really going down to like going deep, spending time there, going on these pages, understanding these groups, see how they work, how they coordinate, and then often you just see and understand the kind of the beast a little better. But what we see is basically there's no real access, and we did as good as we can. And working with Facebook, yes, we kind of bear on, like, we're not working with Facebook, but we were basically in weekly conversations with them, sending them our data, and often they did act after we sent them the data in their own ways, often not very specifically making clear in why they took some action on some specific pieces. But overall, when we share data and information, Facebook was investigating and working on it. So they were not refraining from it. That was a good sign, I think. But in many cases, we found things that I believe should be so obvious to a platform that has much more access to the information.
And Christoph, we have one question on, I think this could be a question both for Sarah and for yourself, that a lot of these answers focus on supply side solutions to disinformation. Are there also, there's a demand side that could be addressed in terms of tackling disinformation? Do you have any thoughts on that? We also have a lot of regulatory questions on, what would be a definition of legal but harmful content? To what extent can we transpose a lot of these learnings from the United States to the EU? For example, we saw a lot of work during the US election in the form of a sort of an election integrity partnership, which was a very interesting collaboration between NGOs, between civil society organizations, government and companies, to track and monitor disinformation. This is the kind of thing that we'd be able to replicate for our own elections in the EU. Is there anything that you could say about, intelligence-related disinformation? Because the EU, I think, has been extremely careful in trying to regulate disinformation. It doesn't traditionally have, I think, competence to regulate in this area. It's very new. I think Vera Jourova herself was saying that she would be taking white gloves and being very careful when it came to this, handling disinformation, which is why that conversation is taking place in the European Democracy Action Plan rather than the DSA. So maybe there's a lot of themes coming through in these questions. We have 15 minutes to cut through a couple of them. So I'll leave the floor to either of you or both of you to answer.
Well, I'm happy to take on the legal but harmful question. I'm an ex-regulator and a lawyer, so of course I love long conversations about definitions. But let's actually try and keep this relatively brief. Yes, you point out the enormous potential grey area that falls if we try and make a clear distinction between what is legal but harmful and what is illegal. I can tell you about our approach. We basically make a clear definition of what we look for in our research, and that's verifiably false information with societal impact. So that may be impact on our rights, public health, our knowledge of climate disinformation, and attacks on democracy. Now that's our definition, but you can see our definition focuses on impact. We don't really care much about the intent of the poster. In fact, we think it's a complete distraction. I know that there are lots of debates in Europe about whether or not you need that, but actually what you're dealing with here isn't content. It doesn't really matter about the intent of the poster. Let's get back to that truth, which is what matters is the scale and the acceleration of that false information till it reaches the point where it has impact. And I think I use the phrase legal but harmful because I think it's really important. It covers everything. But actually, you know, in Sarah's world, we need to regulate disinformation content where it has public impact. So I think, you know, I hope that's not avoiding the question. I think it's actually trying to clarify what are the definitions we actually need to have. And I think there was a question as well about the competence of the EU, which I'm happy just to talk a little about, really. I mean, of course, you know, the competences that EU will have will be created in the Digital Services Act and the European Democracy Action Plan and a code of practice, which maybe has teeth with the regulator back within those two things. But I think I just want to address the raising of GDPR. We think GDPR is a really, really interesting model. You know, the EU led the way in creating rights for consumers, which a lot of territories have resisted. And, you know, we sort of, oh, we've got to tick these boxes about whether or not we consent here and there. Actually, Europe has the best protected rights, the most knowledge about how our data is being used than any other community. And we want the EU to lead the way here. You know, you might have said, there's no way you can wrest back control of your data from these behemoths, but GDPR has done a lot for that. And it's done it with regulation. And we want to see that happening now with disinformation.
Just add to that. Before I add, I want to give a shout out to Maya Matishvili, who in the chat said that the photo that I put in for Georgia is from Tbilisi, the country of Georgia. She perfectly corrected the record. I'm sorry, I just basically Googled Georgia, the first one that looked good I took. So thank you for that correction. That is kind of correction in real time. On the legal but harmful, I don't want to speak on the definition. The way that I'm starting to think of it is like disinformation is to our societies what emissions are to our environment. It's not that we forbid CO2, we don't let you drive your car anymore, but we need to find ways for it to kind of reach a level that our societies can cope with, and that is not being just multiplied and accelerated by the algorithm. And so in this case, it's also, I don't think disinformation itself is a problem, right? If you tell me something, an untruthful story about coronavirus at home, it's not good, but it's not a big problem. The big problem becomes when then millions and millions and millions of people see it, and that is happening because of the algorithm pushing it out to people. And that's where we think regulation is to start. So we have to actually go away from the, I don't know how to call it, like the conversation about content moderation on disinformation. Don't do it. You have to moderate, you have to regulate the amplification of that content and make sure that platforms are transparent to users, regulators, and are accountable. You cannot just say, oh, it's the algorithm. Sorry, we didn't know that the algorithm would push this content out. And that one example I think is really, like, when I read it first time, I was really shocked. I think it's from 2016, where in a Facebook presentation, they said that 64% of all extremist group joins are due to the current recommendation tools. So Facebook's own recommendation tools have recommended 64% of all the people who joined extremist groups at that time, right? I don't think Facebook has ever put such a number into their monthly reports that they give to the EU, because the problem is Facebook just reports what they like to report. They like Facebook and the others, I guess. I haven't seen all the reports, but basically, as long as you don't have clear goals, clear alignment, and an ability for outside academia and experts and regulators to see what's going on behind the scene, we just have platforms tell us how great they are, how much they fight, and that is problematic. And we need to open that black box to see it.
There's one very interesting question from Valentina on tackling disinformation on platforms like WhatsApp, which is a whole other area that I think still needs to be explored. Disinformation end-to-end encrypted channels as well, which is sort of closed networks and disinformation that we do not see public platforms. I don't know if either of you would like to say a word about WhatsApp disinformation, or more generally that type of disinfo.
Chris, you first, or?
I give a short try. Yeah, it's trickier. Like we had a report on disinformation in Spain, and we called it the kind of the dark social web, because as soon as the kind of the big streets, the Facebook and Twitters are being light up more, you kind of go into those darker corners. And we now also see, like in the US and everywhere and other places, there's more of a drive to those, like to the parlors and the other platforms that are not as open and not as transparent. And what we think is already happening is a good step, like the WhatsApp kind of reducing the number of forwards you can do at once. That's some sort of a detox of a slowdown at least of the disinformation spreading. And in our understanding, there are also technical ways for people to, in case they encounter disinformation that has been fact-checked, that there's a way for them to check if it's true or false, right? And I think WhatsApp is working on that, but it needs to be scaled up more. It is more, all we want is more information, not throttle or stop misinformation, but a way for that for people to access truthful information if they're not sure. I think it's really important, right? Because on WhatsApp, like in my own kind of bubble during COVID, there was the place where I got some of the misinformation forwarded without any source, just an audio message. And that's where it becomes really dangerous. On Facebook, at least you have like a way to maybe then find a source, something behind it. And that's why I think on WhatsApp, there needs to be more thinking. It's
true to say it is harder to research, but we have the benefit of 62 million members worldwide. And some of our research on encrypted services has been about their reporting to us. But this kind of underlies, again, the need for transparency, not in terms of the messages that are being sent. Clearly, there would be massive privacy issues there, but in terms of the data that the platforms are collecting, because it is possible to detect virality without breaking encryption of the message. And we need to know more. We need to have more transparency to civil society, but to regulators as well, as to how they are using that in order to stop the most egregious forms. I think that's as far as I'd like to go at the moment. It's in terms of labeling and flagging, and we do understand that any action taken, but this fits in with our principles, that it shouldn't be about decrypting content. It should be about looking at the acceleration of known misinformation.
And moving away slightly from the encryption discussion and a bit more towards also a question of sanctions. We have just 4 minutes left in the discussion, and I just want to touch on this very quickly. How do you tackle repeating offenders? What we see very often is that these networks can be set up by actors that will use the same accounts or be the same actors inventing new personas, and the only way to do that is to sanction the original actor. That could be one possible way of doing it. Do you have any particular thoughts on sanctions, and what type of sanctions we could see that would be compatible with EU law, or that could be compatible with our current regulation here in Europe?
Thank you. So at the moment, as far as we understand, Facebook itself has kind of one standard of likely if you hit 2 clear false misinformation pieces over 3 months, you should be downranked. We don't know who they downrank, and if that is actually a threshold. They never made it public. It's only through kind of hearsay and people speaking about it on the inside. What we think should happen is a broader understanding of that, in the way that I think many of you might know NewsGuard, who rates news websites on different criteria, non-criteria, not just on misinformation, but repeated misinformation, misleading headlines, doesn't issue corrections, right? And so the idea, I think, that where we have to go to is to find a way to define trustworthy sources, but not by Facebook, but in a way of civil society, journalists, academia, to find a way to have a public source to understand what is actually a repeat misinformer and what's a trustworthy source, and then maybe also tell the people, the users on Facebook, if a source is really trustworthy, if they adhere to all these standards, right? And for the algorithm to also become some of this information to then be not just only driven by basically interactions. And we think this still needs a lot of work to really define it, but it is the crux of the matter, right? Is the algorithm is the business model of the platforms in order to keep people on the side. And we have to find a way to make it more healthy and give at least the truthful information some chance. Yeah, and then I think yeah, sorry.
Sorry, and then I think I completely echo what Chris is saying, and perhaps in terms of regulatory sanctions, I don't know if that was what the question was pointing at. Well, then we don't consider regulatory sanctions would apply to the actors; they would apply to the platforms. And in terms of regulatory sanctions on platforms, there are plenty of models to kind of base what the sanctions regime would be, and the sanctions regime should mainly apply to failure to provide information, failure to meet these defined targets, and failure to participate in what we see as this holistic, with input from industry, failure to kind of participate in that regulatory regime. So as an ex-regulator, I could name you numbers, but I don't think that's where we're at quite yet. We just need to understand the mechanisms first.
That's perfect. And I will thank you both for your answers. I think we are now reaching time. I can also hear Sarah. I think it's Sarah. There is a dog that
yeah,
is asking for food.
Just asked her to stop barking.
So just before we wrap up, can I say one last thing, Thomas?
Yes. So I would just ask both of you if in 2-3 words, 2-3 ideas, you could just summarize your statement so that everyone has something to go away with. And I think my colleague will pass on to the final part of the Slido where you can leave us some feedback. And yeah, so Christoph and Sarah, just over to you for a final word.
I think Christoph should summarize. I just want to point out that there are 2 of us here, but we have a team of amazing research and thinkers and campaigners at Avaaz. We have enormous resources. We have a Disinfo hub with all of our reports on, and we really urge you to go and find out more, because I think we're one of the few institutions that are coming up with this robust data. Over to Chris for the final words.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Thomas, and your DisinfoLab. This is awesome. I think the 3 things maybe take away is a lot to take away, I guess, and you can watch the presentation again. But the 3 things is 1, legal but harmful content can be very, very, very harmful if it is accelerated to millions of people. It is being seen and it's being believed at scales that I myself thought is like unbelievable. And really thinking of disinformation as like to our society to be like what emissions are to our environment is a way of, I think, just reframing it, thinking of goals that we want to set, how do we work on this, and really seeing it as a bigger problem. The second one, that we believe regulation should not be about the disinformation content, but the acceleration of the disinformation content. So if millions of people have seen false information served to them by an algorithm, this algorithm should also have, when it has a correction from a fact checker, also send that correction, that information to the person. And so that is the idea, that the platforms are accountable for not the content, but that they themselves accelerate it to millions of people. And that is only possible, we believe by now, only possible to understand and address if there is an opening of the black box and a sort of regulatory authority that can actually understand what is going on the platform. And I think last but not least, honestly, like if not Europe, who then, right? Like I have no idea what other place in the world would be able to take this on, like they took on GDPR, which was tough, like they take on climate now, that is able to balance both democracy protection and freedom of speech, that is able to see through it and understand the freedom of speech argument, but also see that there's real societal harm caused by this. And my daughter, who's 4 now, is at home, she's sick. And I just thought before, like, I think yesterday, she's like, oh, can I go on YouTube? I was like, no, you're not going on YouTube. Because I know what's going on there. And I don't want this to be this way. I want her to grow up in a place where when she takes her phone, I know it's safe. She can talk with her friends. She can understand the truthful information out there. And when she gets older, kind of get an understanding of how the world works, and that we can disagree on issues, but that we can find common ground. And I believe social media can be a beautiful tool to bring us closer together and actually create the world we want, but it can also be the opposite. And we have to fight for it. And I think Europe is destined to do it and lead the world in this one.
Well, thank you very much, Christoph and Sarah, for this discussion. We were ambitious. I think we covered a lot of ground. We will share your presentation with all the participants of the webinar. And I really would recommend, if anyone has specific questions we weren't able to address, drop us an email and we'll get back to you in writing so that we can get back to you that way. I think the next thing to be looking out for is on the 9th of December, the Commission will be releasing its Digital Services Act and its Digital Markets Act, delayed from early December. So everyone is waiting with bated breath to see what that will give. And the European Democracy Action Plan will definitely, if it's released on the 2nd of December, will definitely be an interesting next episode in this regulatory discussion in Europe. With that, I will now move to close the webinar and thank all our participants. Again, we were averaging around 120, 130 participants. We're still at 80 strong. So thank you, everyone. It's been a real pleasure to host you guys. And stay tuned. We will be sending you updates about our upcoming events. And I'm sure Avaaz as well will be organizing a lot of very interesting events in the
Thank you, Thomas.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Thomas. Thanks,
Bye, everybody.
everyone.